Okay, hello again. We're going to do, the topic now is Einstein Dogma enforced by the American science education system. Einstein's relativity is nonsense. That's been dealt with by my other videos. Under ideal conditions it would have been discarded. The scientific process is believed by some to be a self-correcting process, and that is a problem. Why would Einstein be imposed as a dogma? So this sort of thing, that scientific process is supposed to be self-correcting. That's what some people have told me, and so why hasn't Einstein's mistakes been corrected? And the answer is because it's not taking into account the American education system. The American education system is geared to set up dogmas. America became the superpower after World War II, and the way that it wanted to do science has become the standard. Before America took over, critical thinking was encouraged. Since America took over, it became an appeal to a hierarchy of authorities imposing existing beliefs that can't be questioned, and that's the way the America wants to do with its education system. It's a hierarchy of authorities. So that's the way it is, and it's explained by Fred Hoyle that that's the method. It explains how the method of creating dogmas by the American education system works, and he points out before America took over it wasn't done that way. Critical thinking was encouraged. So that's why it's like that. So first of all I'm going to show you Fred Hoyle, and then I'll go into this site here on Cosmology Quest. So let's look at Fred Hoyle. Here, Fred Hoyle. So it's at Wikipedia. Wikipedia gives you a rough idea. So Fred Hoyle, there's a picture of him here. Now passed away in 2001. He was a famous English astronomer, noted primarily for the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis and his often controversial stances on other scientific matters, in particular his rejection of the Big Bang Theory, a term coined by him on BBC Radio. So he's quite a controversial character. He doesn't mind applying critical thinking and going against the tide of what his contemporaries were thinking, and that's contrary to the American system, where they want to impose a hierarchy of authorities, all obeying a sort of party line of what they want to impose as the standard for science. So this is Fred Hoyle, and so he comes out of a education system from England and not an American one. So let's go to him, and this is where this is from a film called the Cosmology Quest. So it's to do with maverick ideas about cosmology. So let's have a look at what Fred Hoyle has to say.
Why you would argue about it?
I've always said that the
Fred
cause
Hoyle.
of the troubles is the American graduate school. You get what?
So he's complaining here, the problem being the American graduate school as being what imposes the dogma of the Big Bang Theory. It doesn't want to consider other alternatives. So jumped into that a bit too sudden, just kind of came back again.
Way, find it very hard to get observing time and so on. And this relates to the whole issue of whether the
Gone back a bit
lack
too
of
far
balance in the way the observational programs and the funding are conducted. anybody would argue about.
Fred Hall in a
I've
minute.
always said that the cause of the troubles is the American graduate school. You get one person who then lectures to his students in graduate class, and because you have a system, you see, when we had graduated first degree, we were independent. We could thumb our noses at the professor.
And that was before the Americans took over the science education. They took their first degree and then they thumbed their noses at what the professors wanted them to study. But under the American system, you've got the older generation professors, a hierarchy of authorities, and they're imposing on the younger generation what to study. So you've got the American way of doing science. And so Fred Hoyle is objecting to that because it's not freedom for the younger generation to study what they want. They're under the thumb of a hierarchy of authorities, older authorities.
Graduate school. You get one person who then lectures to his students in graduate class, and because you have a system, you see, when we had graduated first degree, we were independent. We could thumb our noses at the professor. And in fact, the best way to get ahead was to do something that the older people didn't agree with. And you're right, that was the way to do it. And but in the graduate school, you all have to learn what you're taught, what the professors are teaching you. And then those people go out and get jobs, and they have another graduate, their own graduate school, and it just tier after tier. You get a few places like Caltech or like Harvard, and they set the fashion for every place.
I think
So they set the pressures on doing things. You get the few top professors, and then it filters down that everybody has to do it that sort of way. So what this person says is interesting as well, goes a little bit more detail. So Fred Hoyle.
Professors are teaching you, and then those people go out and get jobs, and they have another graduate, their own graduate school, and it just tier after tier. You get a few places like Caltech or like Harvard, and they set the fashion for every place.
I think there's a problem with graduate education. I think graduate education is not teaching students to think, to be independent researchers. I think it's teaching them to be part of a scientific society. And too much, especially students that are at the so-called elite institutions, I think they're taught too much the paradigm of their advisor.
All of us, whether or not we served in uniform, are veterans of a war in which freedom and free government are at stake. Such fullness of knowledge is the direct function of education. Most of us work hard to provide our homes with every possible comfort for our children. We safeguard their health. We strive to set before them good examples of moral living, of manners and deportment. Possibly, we even pamper them. Yet complacently, even carelessly, we commit our children to schools of which we know but little. We cannot meet the complexities of modern life with outmoded school systems. We must keep our educational standards abreast of the swift-moving times in which we live, if we hope to preserve our national heritage and our American way of life, the American way.
So it all becomes the American way of life, the American dream, the American education system. And whereas before America took over, it was more critical thinking, and it was sort of like the environment which Fred Hoyle came up in. He was prepared to go wherever he liked in his researches. But under the American system, you've got a hierarchy of authorities, and they're imposing onto the younger generation, and it's all to do with what some people call careerism. And if you're as a younger student, maybe you just graduated, if you start being maverick and not going in the directions which your older professors want you to go into, then you're not going to get funding for your researches. Whereas before this American system, you would have done, in the sort of like England, you would have been allowed a bit more freedom.
When I was director of the National Observatory.
So this person has to say is interesting, but I think more interesting is another point further on. 1850. So this person who's going to speak in a minute, not this person, the person's just coming on, he's got some interesting things to say about America and the way they think about things. This John Dobson. So that's what he says.
New telescope in the sky now, you're only going to find what you already know is up there.
I have a lot of trouble with the academic world, the same as I do with the Bible Belt. It's the same kind of trouble. It's the same kind of trouble. It's because they get a picture of this world which they are sure is right.
Yes, yes.
And they hang on to it for all they're worth.
So you've got the religious people in America, the sort of what they call the Bible Belt people, and they really hold on to their dogma of their religious beliefs. And then you've got the scientific community in America, and they've got a hold on the education system, and they're doing the same sort of thing, but with science. They don't want science to change. They want science as it is to stay pretty much in the pattern they've got for it. So you've got two extremes. You either got the religious people who've got their dogma, and now you've got the scientific people who've got their dogma. And it used to be that in science you were having critical thinking and you were prepared to change things, but that's not the way the Americans want to do things. They want religion, which is dogma, and they want science, which is dogma, and they want a hierarchy of authorities opposing that dogma. And so it's very weird for me, from an English background, to realise that's the American way that they want to do things. So just go back and pick up what John Dobson says again to highlight it.
You're only going to find what you already know is up there.
Yep.
I have a lot of trouble with the academic world, the same as I do with the Bible Belt. It's the same kind of trouble. It's the same kind of trouble. It's because they get a picture of this world which they are sure is right.
Yes, yes.
And they hang on to it for all they're worth. But I often point out that I am probably more unorthodox than anyone who has ever burned at the stake. It's illegal now.
Burning.
It's illegal now to burn somebody to the stake in your backyard.
So that's roughly it. So that's the American education system. It's a dogma, and it's quite weird. And so what's happened is Einstein has had a great influence on science, and he's had an effect on cosmology. We can now look at the history of that a bit, and then we'll come to a person who is rebelling against the standard cosmology, and he's found that the science people in America have formed their dogma upon building what Einstein's been saying. So let's have a quick look at the history. It's highlighted by here, 207. This is picking it up from Einstein. From Einstein's theories, we've got modern cosmology, and from that you've got the idea of the universe expanding. So we'll just go into this a bit.
When Einstein proposed this, it's a theory of gravity, which means that it's a theory which should represent the whole of the universe, because it's gravitational forces that are controlling the universe. Well, Einstein made this theory around 1915, and he immediately wanted to try and use this theory to explain the universe as it then was, the so-called Milky Way system. But of course, the idea of this was that it was a static system. That is, it wasn't contracting or expanding, it was a static system. And Einstein found that his equations did not allow for a static universe unless he inserted a certain constant in the mathematics, which became known as the cosmological constant. But what happened in the early 1920s was that a very clever Russian called Friedman in 1922 found solutions to Einstein's equations which allow the universe to either expand or contract. Now that was done in the Soviet Union soon after the revolution, and nobody in the West knew about this, I think. But in 1927, a Belgian priest, the Abbé Lemaitre, as he later became, also discovered these solutions. And he went to England, and his work was publicized in Cambridge and elsewhere, and the famous English astronomer Sir Arthur Eddington and others got to know about this, and they immediately began to say, how can this apply to the current universe? Well, in the same period, in 1929, Hubble made what I still believe was the most important discovery in extragalactic astronomy in the last century, or the last century but one. He showed that if you look at the spiral nebulae, the faint spiral nebulae, the shifts in their spectra are proportional to their apparent brightnesses. And this led very soon to the idea that this fitted very well with the expanding universe, and that indeed this is the kind of universe we lived in, that what we were looking at are galaxies, Milky Ways, further and further away from us, and the further away from us, the larger the redshifts, and if that's interpreted in the way that most people would interpret it, this means that they are moving away faster and faster. So this was the original idea. By the 1930s, the front page of the New York Times said we live in an expanding universe.
So there we go. That is the standard cosmology, and it's all built up from Einstein. So from Einstein, you've got the standard cosmology, where it's the universe believed to be expanding. And so when America takes on the lead for being dominant in science, it's sort of like that is the orthodoxy which it's going to impose, is the dogma that the universe is expanding, and that it's all based on Einstein. So it's all believing all of that. Those are foundations upon which it's going to believe, and it's not going to be critical anymore of that. It wants to impose that as dogma and keep it that way, with its hierarchy of authorities imposing that. So when it starts finding, when people start finding things which are contrary to that, it's like the person is going to be Art, when he can explain that they try to suppress him. They try to suppress evidence which is contrary to the dogma. So if I go on to Art now, 843. Picking it up from ARP. This is ARP, so he's gonna. There's the question raised. Questions are raised, and maybe the universe isn't expanding. Maybe the evidence is showing that it's not expanding. But now that this dogma that the universe is expanding, they don't want to consider evidence where the universe isn't expanding. And this is what this happens to mavericks who find things which goes against their dogma.
And the quasar. Are quasars ejected from galaxies, and in fact proto-galaxies themselves? Is there some other astrophysical process which can explain the redshift discrepancies? One of the world's most controversial experts on the structure and morphology of quasars Halton C. Arp, has for 35 years proposed just such an idea. For the heresy of opposing orthodox interpretations of the redshift problem, Arp has had to pay a heavy price, the same price paid by many a scientist with new and innovative ideas. Dr. Arp was forced to resign from his permanent position at the Carnegie Institute of Washington Observatories after the Caltech head of the Telescope Allocation Committee threatened him by saying, unless he changed his line of research, they would take away his telescope time.
So you start doing research in science and you find something which goes against the dogma which the American science community, their education system, is trying to impose, then you're finding yourself in problems. And this is what this person, Halton Arp, found out when he's finding things which don't fit in with their dogma, which is the expanding universe. He's going to find they're trying to stop him.
After the Caltech head of the Telescope Allocation Committee threatened him by saying, unless he changed his line of research, they would take away his telescope time. Due to this fact and his ongoing struggle against the established paradigms, Arp is often referred to as the modern Galileo.
I remember when I
referred to as the modern Galileo, and I'm going to point out there that the Galileo in his time was opposed to the dogma what the Catholic Church was giving about science. And the Catholic Church was trying to impose a scientific dogma, and so that was then. But now in the modern time we have the American education system, and that imposes dogma as well. So you've got history repeating itself in a way when you're finding scientific facts which go against their American dogma, then you're going to find that you're being persecuted in the same sort of way as Galileo was. In the case of Galileo, the Catholic Church threatened him eventually with torture, and eventually he recanted under that sort of threat. But in the case of modern researchers, if you're finding something which goes against dogma, then what they can do is they just stop funding your research, or they and other tactics like that. So it's not so severe as what they were doing to Galileo, but it's still trying to suppress the truth. So this American system has become more adapted to suppressing the truth as opposed to what the Catholic system had. So picking up by what Arp is going to explain how he was affected when his research was finding things contrary to what they wanted to believe.
Fact and his ongoing struggle against the established paradigms, Arp is often referred to as the modern Galileo.
I remember when I sent the paper into the first paper into Astrophysical Journal on the nature of companion galaxies, and I had a lot of them on the ends of spiral arms, so I was sure that they were connected, and I showed that they were systematically redshifted. I sent that in with naive, great expectations that people would be terribly interested and impressed on this. And the editor of the Astrophysical Journal at that time was Subramanian Chandrasekhar, who had a fantastic reputation as a master theoretician and also quite an incomprehensible theoretician, and a tremendously powerful figure in the field, and editor of the Astrophysical Journal, which was probably the most powerful position in the field. And he chose not to, in his wisdom and judicial fairness, chose not to send it to a referee, but he just wrote across the paper, "This exceeds my imagination," and he sent it back to the director of my institute.
So there you go. You send your research paper in to a science journal, and the standard practice now is to reject it if it doesn't fit in with dogma. So that's how bad it is. Rather than look at anonymous data and wonder what's going on, they just want to reject it. They say things like it exceeds your imagination. We just reject it. We don't even send it out for peer review. We're just going to reject it. And this paper, which they rejected, they sent it back to the boss of ARP. This is the boss here. And by having a paper sent back to him like that, it then has repercussions. It's sort of like, well, you shouldn't be funding this research. That is the sort of pressure. Research which doesn't agree with the dogma, they don't want funded. So how do you get real scientific progress if you are not allowed to have critical thinking and have critical studies and so forth? You're just going to have suppression of the truth. So, and that's unfortunately what's going on here with the American system.
He chose not to, in his wisdom and judicial fairness, chose not to send it to a referee, but he just wrote across the paper, "This exceeds my imagination," and he sent it back to the director of my institute, Horace Babcock, with the obvious implication, you've got to do something about this staff member of yours who's doing these very bad things. And so Horace called me down in the office one day after this, and I walked in his office, into the director's office, and I saw this paper lying in front of him with Chandrasekhar scroll across it. And Horace looked at me and said, "Well," he said, "this is just too much, and you're going to have to start looking for another job." And so all I could say to him was, "Well, if you send me that in writing."
So that's the implications. You do research and it's not conforming to the dogma, and then the pressure's on to stop that research. In the case of this one, Horton Art managed to wiggle around the system for a while and carries on his research, but that is the sort of threat you're under. If you don't conform to the dogma, your research is going to be blocked.
It's just too much, and you're going to have to start looking for another job. And so all I could say to him was, "Well, if you send me that in writing, please send me it in writing." And I was waiting in great trepidation for weeks and months to get something in writing, and I finally never did, so I realized that he decided to give me another chance, so to speak. So that was fairly early in the game, and then some years went by, and there was the competition for time, particularly on the 200-inch telescope, was getting more and more heated, and people were saying, "Well, we can't continue to give time to this obviously incorrect and embarrassing research that ARP does." So finally they sent a letter to me from the allocation committee, including a number of the younger members of my institute, saying that unless I changed my line of research, that they would have to take away my telescope time.
So that's how it's done. So you do some research. It's going against their dogma. They decide they don't want to publish your research. That's suppression of alternative points of view, and then the pressure is on to close down your research, and the justification is for it. Well, they just assume your research is wrong, in which case they're funding something which they assume to be wrong, and so it's not worth their money to fund something which they assume to be wrong. And if you go back to the beginning here, 207, all their cosmology is built from this person here, so everything's built up from cosmology upon what this person is thinking about in theory. So that's become the dogma, and it's not how you're supposed to do science. They've created a science to be a dogma in the same way religion is a dogma. In the way you're supposed to do science, you're supposed to apply critical thinking, but they managed to close that down. You've got authority figures who are imposing what research is to be done, and they close down anything which is going to interfere with what they have set up as dogma. So that is quite amazing, really. So I've got more here about, it's a tribute to Halton Arp here. You can see that tribute to Halton Arp, who's passed away, and he, so they proved what we find, that Hubble himself, who was supposed to have found the discovery that the universe expanded, he wasn't really convinced of that. Hubble queried that, but it becomes the dogma that the universe is expanding. So we'll go into this little article, this video about Halton Arp. American astronomer Halton Christian Arp passed away December 28. He was 86. Arp was a world-renowned expert on interacting and merging galaxies. His 1966 book, Atlas of Peculiar Galaxies, helped astronomers realise how galaxies change over time. It contains photographs of 338 nearby galaxies that astronomers could not classify into one of the traditional shapes for those objects. And what he's been collecting, data on things that don't seem to fit in with the standard view of an expanding universe. So let's have a look of this video.
2013, the acclaimed astronomer Halton Arp passed away at the age of 86 in his home in Munich, Germany. Arp posed a challenge to the very foundations of modern cosmology, a challenge that only grows more relevant with new, astonishing discoveries. We present Wal Thornhill as we honor Arp's remarkable contributions to science and astronomy.
I was first introduced to Halton Arp's work by Mel and Amy Aitchison after one of our very first meetings in Portland, Oregon. They could see the relevance of Arp's discoveries to the electric universe that I was then presenting. That was in the mid-90s. In September 2000, I had my first meeting with Halton Arp in Portland, once again at one of the Electric Universe meetings. And it was quite a historic meeting because of the other people who were there, in particular Tony Peratt, who is known for his groundbreaking work in plasma cosmology. And the input from both of these people to the Electric Universe has been considerable. It was only a month later in October that I actually shared the stage in London with Halton Arp. Unfortunately, he was busy at the time, involved with a filmmaker making the documentary The Cosmology Quest, which is now available on DVD. Halton, known as Chip Arp, was a professional astronomer who, earlier in his career, conducted Edwin Hubble's NOVA search in M31. He earned the Helen B. Warner Prize, the Newcomb Cleveland Award, and the Alexander von Humboldt Senior Scientist Award. For 28 years he was staff astronomer at the Mount Palomar and Mount Wilson observatories. While there, he produced his well-known catalogue of peculiar galaxies that are disturbed or irregular in appearance. Arp discovered that many pairs of quasars with extremely high redshift values are physically connected to galaxies that have low redshift and are known to be relatively close by. Yet according to the Big Bang expanding universe, the high redshift quasars must be located far behind the nearby galaxy. Because of Arp's observations, the assumption that high redshift objects have to be very far away, on which the Big Bang theory and all of accepted cosmology is based, has to be fundamentally re-examined.
While mainstream cosmology has come to...
Has to be fundamentally re-examined, but unfortunately the Big Bang theory has become dogma, and it's all been built up from Einstein. All the mistakes have been built upon, and it's become dogma. So all my videos, if I can find them, my videos, I've been complaining about lots of things about Einstein. So we've got a person here, for instance, Dr. Brian Wallace, who finds evidence that Einstein's wrong from his researches, and he finds it gets blocked, and so his conclusion is that physics is a farce. So I've done that video. Next, go to the next page. Next, letting lots of processes And if we go on that one, and it's an article by G. Bernstein Brown, who's looked at what Einstein's doing. What Einstein does doesn't make sense, and so in his article, What is Wrong with Relativity, he points out what Einstein is doing in this theorising is a cuckoo process. Cuckoo is crazy. Whatever Einstein does doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. So that's one person pointing out how crazy Einstein is. And then it's a Professor Roger Wyden. Professor Roger Wyden given a talk on this one, and he's gone into a great deal of study of Einstein's maths in general relativity, and basically the end of it, it doesn't make sense. And so you having all these things as being dogma in the American science community. You've suddenly got all these mistakes as dogma. There's an example of the maths I pointed out, an example of the maths as used by Einstein, and it's just nonsense. You go for the maths and you say it's just nonsense, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So you've got all that, it's all just become dogma. It's all believed by the physics community, American physics system, that that sort of thing will maybe dogma, and you can't correct it. Einstein has become classified as a super genius, so forth. All the mistakes and so forth are what they're building upon, and they're just carrying on. So this is what you get. You get all this story about a Big Bang and so forth as cosmology, all built upon what Einstein is saying, and it's just added to it. They've added more things to it. They've added this thing called inflation. At the early beginning of the universe, they suddenly decided the universe had to expand at a faster rate than the speed of light, and they call that inflation. And they also work out, well, why is it if the universe is expanding, so they have to come up with an idea called dark energy. And so they sort of like wonder about, well, there's not enough matter. We can observe a certain amount of matter in the universe, but there needs to be more. So they come up with this idea of dark matter. So they just keep adding things to what they believe from Einstein. We can go back a bit. So this is the cosmology picture. They've built up all this picture up from Einstein, Big Bang universe, and they don't want to consider alternatives. They try to suppress it.
Has to be fundamentally re-examined.
While mainstream cosmology has come to embrace the story of the Big Bang and the expanding universe, cosmologist Carl Sagan noted the challenge that Halton and Arp's discoveries pose to the standard theory. In his 1980 bestseller Cosmos, Sagan wrote, "There is nevertheless a nagging suspicion among some astronomers that all may not be right with the deduction from the redshift of galaxies via the Doppler effect that the universe is expanding. The astronomer Halton Arp has found enigmatic and disturbing cases where a galaxy and a quasar, or a pair of galaxies that are in apparent physical association, have very different redshifts."
So you've got this problem that they're posing the Big Bang as a dogma, and really they don't want to talk about the controversy where they've got evidence which seems to suggest that the Big Bang theory is wrong, and it's coming from this person, Halton Arp. So they try to suppress this controversy. They try and toe the kind of like party line where we've got one point of view and we suppress anything else.
However, some believe that institutional science's response to Arp's challenge is a disturbing example of political suppression.
A disturbing example of political suppression. So you've got the Big Bang theory, and they're promoting that as the dogma, and you're suppressing alternatives. Science isn't supposed to be like that, but under the American system it is.
Is a disturbing example of political suppression.
Arp's life story exemplifies everything that's wrong with modern showbiz science. His paper, Companion Galaxies on the Ends of Spiral Arms, which offered a fundamental challenge to Big Bang cosmology, had Subramanian Chandrasekhar's scrawl across the top corner, "This exceeds my imagination." That may have been so, given Chandrasekhar and those like him had a great deal to lose, but it was not a scientific reason.
So there's point making the point that those people have a great deal to lose. It's their you've got a hierarchy of authorities, and their authority comes from imposing the dogma. And if you're trying to get evidence through presented which is going against their dogma, you are undermining their authority, and they don't like that. They don't like it. So they're going to stop. They're going to try to block research which undermines their authority as much as they can.
Him had a great deal to lose,
Great deal to
but
lose.
it was not a scientific reason for rejection of Arp's observations. However, Arp's telescope time was curtailed and he was forced to continue his research in Germany. Halton Arp has been dubbed a modern Galileo because other scientists refuse to see what is obvious even to amateur astronomers.
So what happened was Galileo was making astronomical observations, and it was undermining the existing dogma of his day. He was observing things which didn't fit in with existing dogma, and you've got the same sort of situation here, that Arp is making astronomical observations and it doesn't fit in with the existing dogma. In the case of Galileo, they shut him up. They threatened him and shut him up. In the case of Arp, they just try to ignore it. They suppress articles being published on it by him, and they try to suppress research upon what he's talking about. So it's the same sort of thing. Truth is supposed to go through 3 stages, where first stage is you ignore it, second stage is you ridicule it, and third stage is you accept it as true. In the case of Arp, they're trying to ignore it. Stage 1, they're trying to ignore it as much as possible. They don't want the block articles being published with that sort of information. So that's how bad it is. And if you go back far enough, well, it's all built on Einstein, and Einstein, as I pointed out, is wrong, but is no dogma to build upon him.
That low redshift galaxies are often found connected to high redshift companions. Clearly, most of the redshift is intrinsic to the companions. At a single stroke, Arp removed the foundation for Big Bang cosmology. He had in fact proven Edwin Hubble, his mentor, correct, for Hubble had written in the Royal Astronomical Society monthly notices in 1930.
So Hubble is credited with giving us the Big Bang, and with giving us the idea that the universe is expanding. So from his astronomical observations, he's given us the Big Bang theory of the universe expanding, but later observations by Arp show that it doesn't fit into that sort of way of talking about it. And Hubble, when he looked at the redshift, which is supposed to show the expansion of the universe, he himself actually was sceptical that that's what it actually showed. So we'll go back a bit. So you've got the kind of crazy thing where Hubble is getting credit to something which he himself was sceptical about.
He had in fact proven Edwin Hubble, his mentor, correct, for Hubble had written in the Royal Astronomical Society monthly notices in 1937, and I quote, "If the redshifts are a Doppler shift, the observations as they stand lead to the anomaly of a closed universe, curiously small and dense, and it may be added, suspiciously young. On the other hand, if redshifts are not Doppler effects, these anomalies disappear and the region observed appears as a small, homogeneous, but insignificant portion of a universe extended indefinitely both in space and time." End of quote. The irony is that the constant defining the hypothetical rate of expansion of the universe bears Hubble's name. The winners rewrite history. Arp proved Hubble right. We live in a universe extended indefinitely both in space and time. Halton Arp believed in the scientific approach more strongly, it seems, than do mainstream scientists. Arp notes that his opponents invariably stated that, and I quote, "The observations cannot be accepted because there's no theory to explain them." End of quote.
No, that bit he didn't really know about, but there is a theory. If you reject if you suddenly say Einstein's got it all wrong and you reject that, you can go back to an earlier theory, and I've sort of found that earlier theory. And yeah, there you go. So it's this person here. It's Boscovich in the 18th century gave a unified theory based upon Newtonian physics, and if I can enlarge it, I've Roger Boscovich, the founder of modern science, and this book is written by Dragoslav Stokovich, and I've translated it. And this person, he's a professor of chemistry, and he's explained that quantum physics has come from Boscovich's theory. And so with Boscovich's theory, you've got the forces of between particles is obeying this sort of curve, and so that leads on to the idea of quantized orbits. So you apply this law to atoms, where we got the electrons in orbit around the atom obeying this law, and then you apply this law to planets. So you've got planets in the solar system being quantized as well, quantized orbits around the sun. So in the case of, say, the galaxies being spread out, you would expect those galaxies to obey this sort of law as well. So you would have quantized distances for galaxies. So there is actually a theory which is dealing with what ARP has discovered. So when he's saying that there's no theory for it, there was the earlier theory pre-Einstein.
The observations cannot be accepted because there's no theory to explain them.
So it was classical physics, or what you call Newtonian physics, a unified theory of Newtonian physics with its idea, which then led on to quantum physics.
End of quote. Of course, the companion statement was always, and I quote again, "There is no need to modify conventional theories because there are no valid observations which contradict them." Clearly, these two statements have always provided the perfect double bind against progress in the subject. ARP has had dramatic confirmation, which involved also Sir Fred Hoyle, Geoffrey and Margaret Burbage, and J. Nalika. And he says, with one object, NGC 3516, we had confirmed 1. The alignment of quasars along the minor axis, that is the spin axis of the parent galaxy. 2. The decay of the redshift and increase of luminosity as the quasars travelled outward. 3. Their evolution into companion galaxies. And 4, and very important, the quantization of the evolving redshift steps.
Yeah.
ARP writes,
the quantization of the redshifts, that would be tying into Boscovich's theory. Go back to him, Boscovich. You would be expecting quantized redshifts from that theory. So this is what Einstein's done. They built on Einstein, and actually you've had a better theory than Einstein in the 18th century.
Important, the quantization of the evolving redshift steps. ARP writes, since science is supposed to be characterized by successful prediction, it is significant to note that this most important single observation of quasars being ejected from an active low redshift galaxy was rejected without ever being sent to a referee by that leading journal of trustworthy and important results, Nature magazine. ARP.
Yeah, so if you're sending in data research upon things which are contradicting their dogma, then they don't want to accept it, and they just want to reject it. And that's the problem. Einstein has become the dogma.
ARP also writes, the most influential people in the field, in their jovial camaraderie, would simply ridicule anyone who had reported discordant result.
That would be stage 2. Truth's supposed to go through 3 stages. Stage 1, ignore it. Stage 2 would be to ridicule it. So that's what you're through. Science is just following the same processes. Same process over and over again. Ignore observations which contradict your dogma. Then second stage, ridicule observations that contradict your dogma, and then hopefully you eventually get to stage 3, where eventually the truth has to be accepted, but it is a very long process.
How can one fight rumour? I think the only answer is that one must fundamentally change the structure of academic science. Communication must be directly to fellow researchers and the public, with no chance of censorship.
So that's basically it. So at the moment, under the dogma of Einstein, things are being censored. You're getting things blocked, and Fred Hoyle has noticed that. If we go now to the conclusion of it. So, the American education system does not encourage critical thinking, and it is just about being subservient to hierarchical authorities who choose how the money is spent and hence suppress what is contrary to what they believe. That's the situation. Whereas before the Americans became the world superpower, science was done in a different way. They have enforced the dogma of working from Einstein, and they just then continue building on layers of mistakes. So Einstein made loads of mistakes, and they're forced on that as dogma, and you're just building upon it. They believe certain things have been established, and in the case of Einstein they have chosen to believe numerous mistakes. So they've believed lots of mistakes. Einstein made lots of mistakes, but rather than recognising those as mistakes by applying critical thinking, they're just building on it. And now they refuse to consider what are now dogmatic beliefs. So they've got a dogmatic belief in Einstein, and that's what they're building upon. The American education system is geared to enforce certain beliefs and not to question those beliefs. It is all part of the American dream. It's all part of how America has been set up from its very beginning. It's to enforce dogma. Go back. And so when you're pointing out all the things wrong with Einstein and all the things that have been built on the lie upon which Einstein's built, they try just to suppress it. They try to suppress it. They don't want to consider what they've got is wrong. They want to keep building upon it. And it's not just me who's noticed it. I've got people who have also noticed what's going on here. You've got other people like Tom Bethel, Professor Roger Ryden, and Dr. Wallace. Loads of people. You're finding they're being blocked. So that's it. That's the end of this little talk. Thank you.